As a child, I always knew that for my parents, I was just a second choice, like an extra card in a deck kept only in case the main cards were lost. My name is Elma, and from my earliest conscious memories, I saw my parents surround my older brother, David, with a blaze of attention, care, and boundless possibilities, while I remained in the shadows, realizing with each passing year that there was no mistake in their preference. It was their conscious choice, the difference in their attitudes toward David and me wasn't hidden behind hints or soft undertones. It was naked and stark, like harsh sunlight from which it was impossible to turn. I clearly remember our evenings at the kitchen table, when the two of us pored over our homework, while Mom and Dad drove David to yet another singing competition or to a school club meeting, from which he returned radiant and proud. David was only 3 years older than me, but this only seemed to be a huge gap. His age seemed to justify all the special attention he received. As soon as his teachers mentioned his voice or some small success, his parents saw him as a future star, rushing to spend their last savings on music lessons and equipment that shone in our living room as a reminder of their beliefs. David has such an amazing voice, my mother would repeat enthusiastically to anyone who would listen, and it seemed as if her pride was swelling inside her. She could spend hours telling her neighbors how he would one day be someone special, and her eyes shone with a holy conviction, as if fate had already decided everything. During this time, I was learning to keep quiet and not ask for more than I needed, because my first experience with asking had been bitter. When I plucked up the courage to say I wanted to enroll in art classes, my mother only smiled tenderly, bowed her head, and said apologetically, "Maybe next semester, dear. Right now, David's vocal lessons are eating up our entire budget." It was at that moment that I first truly felt the difference, as if an invisible wall stood between my brother and me, separating not only our parents' attention but also the very possibility of dreaming. Things became even more acute when David reached his senior year. I was only 15 then, and I already understood how our family worked, but I still hoped that things would change one day. We were sitting at dinner, and I was trying not to draw attention to myself, when my father, with a beaming smile, raised his head and, as if he were on stage, said, "We have a big announcement for you, David. We've been saving up, and now we can send you to Preston College. It's one of the most prestigious schools in the state." I saw my brother's eyes light up with excitement, and my mother quickly added, "And that's not all, dear. You can live in our apartment near campus, rent-free. We want you to focus completely on your studies." I looked down at my plate, swiping green peas around to hide the disappointment lodged in my throat. No one noticed, of course. They were mesmerized by the glow on David's face, who was already making plans for the future, sharing his dreams, and speaking with such confidence, as if it wasn't someday but tomorrow. And that same night, lying in my room and listening to his phone conversations with friends drift through the wall, I began to count and calculate. If so much money was being spent on his education, if they were paying for his housing and providing all the necessary amenities, then there would be nothing left for me. The realization hit me like cold water, but instead of bursting into tears, for the first time in my life, I decided not to wait, but to act. The next day, I went to my grandparents' antique shop, where the air smelled of old wood, copper, and memories. My grandfather, tall and still surprisingly cheerful, listened attentively as I haltingly explained my situation and how I feared my college dreams would remain just that, dreams. He was silent for a long moment, then narrowed his eyes and, leaning against the counter, said, "Elma, I could just give you the money for college." He paused for a moment, stroking his chin thoughtfully. And I almost breathed a sigh of relief. But then he added, "But I think it would be much better for you if you earned it yourself. How about working here after school?" And so it all began. While David was packing his bags and preparing for his bright future at a prestigious college, I, without complaining or asking for help, immersed myself in my grandparents' antique shop. Every day after school, dusty display cases, old books with yellowed pages, and clocks that seemed to tick more slowly than the others, as if they had a life of their own, awaited me. I learned not only to dust porcelain figurines and carefully arrange silver candlesticks, but also to listen to the stories my grandfather told about each object, its past, and the people to whom it once belonged. My grandmother brought me hot pies or sliced apples and shared stories of her own childhood, when such things were considered part of everyday life, not museum exhibits. I hung on her every word, because behind them lay not just memory, but wisdom, in which I found support. My parents' reaction to my story about working and saving for my education was a true revelation. They expressed neither surprise nor indignation. On the contrary, I detected relief and something akin to gratitude in their voices, as if I'd lifted a burden of responsibility from their shoulders by solving my own problem. "That's wonderful, Elma," Mom said with a gentle smile, and Dad merely nodded and returned to his work, as if I'd brought home polite news of little consequence. 3 years in the antique shop flew by, and with each passing day I felt myself growing stronger, more independent, and, most importantly, more confident in my success. Every evening, as I dusted the dark oak cabinets, lovingly polished the brass knobs, or helped customers choose porcelain cups, I knew that these efforts weren't in vain, that I was building my own future, and when I finally graduated, I could proudly say to myself that I had saved enough money to attend college. Unlike David's, my graduation was a quiet affair, no celebratory banquet, no crowds of guests, just a quiet dinner with my family. But this didn't upset me at all, because at that modest table, I felt not defeat, but pride in having achieved everything myself, without gifts or handouts from others. I enrolled in a local state college, choosing a practical business program that was affordable enough and didn't break the bank, allowing me to live comfortably at home and even save a little for the future. Every morning I took the bus to campus, and though the rides were long and unromantic, I found a quiet strength in them. During those hours on the road, I reviewed my notes, looked out the window at the streets where other people hurried, and thought that this is what adult life looks like: no frills, but with a firm understanding of why you're moving forward. One evening, I timidly mentioned to my parents that perhaps I should buy a used car. It would save me time and energy, and would also allow me to earn extra money. Dad didn't even look up from his phone and said briefly, "Sorry, Elma, we really don't have the money right now," and Mom interjected, softening her tone as usual, "The bus system works great, honey, lots of students use it." I bit my lip to keep from reminding them how they helped David get his driver's license and paid for part of his first car, because for them it had already become a distant, almost forgotten story, as if it had never existed. The first year of college flew by surprisingly quickly, and just as I was preparing for my spring exams, our house was once again filled with a storm of emotions, but this time they weren't caused by me. David was graduating from Preston College, and Mom and Dad had thrown him a lavish celebration, inviting what seemed like half the town. The house was overflowing with relatives, neighbors, and friends, all there to share in the excitement of my brother's latest achievement. I was standing in the kitchen, setting out plates of appetizers and trying to keep my composure, when the door swung open and David walked in, beaming, with a pretty blonde on his arm. It was Sarah, his girlfriend from college, and they were so close and so happy that their smiles lit up the room. All eyes immediately turned to them, and David, like an actor on stage, loudly declared, "Sarah and I have amazing news, we are engaged." The room exploded with shouts, laughter, and joyful applause. Mom broke down and burst into tears, wiping away tears of happiness, and Dad slapped David on the back so hard that for a moment I thought he would stagger. "But that's not all," Sarah added in her sweet, honey-like voice. "After the wedding, we're moving to Connecticut. My parents have a successful business there, and they want us to continue it." At that moment, Mom's tears turned into full-blown sobs, and Dad, beaming as if he'd won the grand prize himself, declared, "My baby boy will become a successful businessman. I always knew you were destined for great things." I stood in the corner of the room, watching the proceedings as if it were someone else's celebration, one I had nothing to do with. Even though I was part of the family, no one seemed to notice that I had just finished my freshman year of college with a perfect 4.0 GPA, that I juggled my studies with a job at a local cafe, where I spent my evenings and weekends behind the counter, and yet I never let my knowledge diminish. However, there was nothing surprising about this, as I had already become accustomed to this strange, invisible existence near my family, where my efforts seemed to dissolve into thin air, unnoticed. The entire next year was spent preparing for David and Sarah's wedding, and while I was focused on my studies, Mom and Dad were in a kind of festive whirlwind, discussing flowers, the menu, and the fabric for the tablecloths, as if the bride were their daughter and not a girl from out of town. By then, I was already in my third year of university, and every day I felt my brother and I's lives diverging further and further. He was basking in happiness and attention, and I was building my future. Step by step, my parents took out a substantial loan to throw them the perfect celebration: hall rental, catering, music, photographers, and even fireworks. Everything was taken care of, and it didn't matter that they would have to bear these debts for many years to come. The wedding itself was exactly as I'd imagined: loud, extravagant, full of laughter, tears of joy, and endless toasts, and everything, of course, revolved around David. I stood there in a bridesmaid dress I'd paid for myself, with my modest savings, and watched my parents beam with pride as they danced with the newlyweds, as if it were the best day of their lives. They spared no expense or effort, oblivious to everything but this beautiful picture, and in that moment, I suddenly realized that after David and Sarah left for Connecticut, they would have to pay off the mortgage for years to come, but neither of them had even considered that. Later, back in my cramped bedroom at my parents' house, I stared at the stacks of textbooks spread out on the table, and a thought occurred to me that made my heart beat faster. The apartment David had lived in during college was now empty, and it was just a short distance from my campus. This could give me the independence I'd long dreamed of, freeing me from tedious bus rides and allowing me to focus on my studies. That evening, as my parents sat in front of the TV, engrossed in yet another show, I mustered up all my courage and approached them. "Mom, Dad," I began, trying to keep my voice even, "since David's apartment is now empty, would you mind if I moved in?" They exchanged glances, and I saw a hint of surprise on their faces, as if the very idea of me laying claim to what their son had once enjoyed seemed unusual to them. Mom spoke first. "Okay, honey, you can move in, but you'll have to pay rent." These words hit me like a slap in the face. Rent? David was living there rent-free, after all, and his parents had said back then that they wanted him to focus on his studies. I felt my face heat up, and trying not to scream, I quietly said, "I'm your daughter too. I've never asked you for anything. I earned my own money for college, I ride the bus, I work myself to the bone." My father shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes cast down, and muttered, "Things are different now. We have a wedding loan to pay off, and we decided we needed the extra income." I couldn't believe my ears. It felt like I'd been betrayed over and over again, and each such scene left new scars on me. My mother raised her hand, stopping me, and after a silent exchange of glances with my father, the same silent conversation they always had when deciding whether to pay for David's new clubs or trips, she said, "Okay, we'll only charge you half the usual rent." I wanted to argue, to yell, to remind them of everything I'd done myself, but I knew this was the best I could hope for. "Okay, I'll take it," I breathed out. "I'll move this weekend." And so I found myself in an apartment where traces of David's presence still remained: holes in the walls from his once hung posters, stains on the coffee table from the coffee cups he used to study for exams, the scent of his perfume lingering in the curtains. I had to pick up extra shifts at the cafe to cover even this half of the rent, and I often returned home in the morning, exhausted, and then went back to lectures, then to the counter, and back to my textbooks. My last year of college passed in a blur, where everything blurred together: the pages of textbooks, the steam from the coffee machine, tired eyes in the mirror, and the rare hours of sleep when I'd fall asleep right over my notes, the alarm ringing as if it had never stopped. Before I knew it, graduation day had arrived, and while my classmates and their families were planning parties, booking restaurants, and taking photos in decorated halls, my parents decided to throw a quiet dinner at home, inviting only my grandparents. No extended family, no friends, no proud speeches or elaborate dishes like at the Feast of David, just us at a modest table, with a plate of lasagna I'd made myself. I sat there, trying to contain the joy of my own accomplishment, when my grandmother reached across the table, gently squeezed my hand, and, looking me straight in the eye, said, "Elma, darling, I'm so proud of you, graduating with honors while working part-time. That's quite an accomplishment." Her words warmed me more than the surroundings, but before I could respond, my mother's phone vibrated on the table. She glanced at the screen, and her face lit up with joy. Speaking of accomplishments, she interrupted the conversation and read aloud the message. "This is David. He's writing to say things are going great. Their business is expanding into 2 new locations." I watched my graduation dinner smoothly turn into another celebration of David's success in Connecticut, and I felt the little attention I'd been given slipping from my own hands. My parents and grandparents exchanged glances, and only my grandfather discreetly placed his hand on my shoulder, squeezing it tightly. as if to remind me, I see you, I appreciate you. Fortunately, all my efforts in college began to bear fruit much faster than I could have hoped. Just 2 weeks after graduation, I landed a position at Anderson and Mitchell, one of the most prestigious firms in the city, and when they told me my starting salary, I could hardly resist smiling wider than was proper. It was more than I had ever dreamed possible, and for the first time, I felt like my life was finally beginning to unfold according to my own rules. My excitement, however, only lasted 3 days, until my parents learned of my new position and salary. On one of our unexpected visits, Mom walked into the apartment, looked around, and said in that tone that brooked no argument, "Elma, dear, now that you're making good money, you have to start paying full rent." I stared at her as if I'd misheard and reminded her, "But we agreed on half when I was a student." She merely shrugged and replied as if it were self-evident, "You can afford it now." I wanted to object that David had lived there rent-free even after he got a job, that our family rules had always been different for him and for me, but in that moment I realized the futility of the comparison. It was a dead-end road, and I simply gritted my teeth, agreeing because the apartment was only a 10-minute walk from the office. And that fact outweighed my resentment. Life gradually became routine. I threw myself into my work, determined to prove at any cost that I was worthy of my position and that I could achieve more. Every morning I woke up determined to advance professionally, and every month, like clockwork, my mother would call and invariably remind me that the rent was due on Friday. "Elma, dear, we're counting on that money." I would nod silently, even if she couldn't see my face on the other end of the line, and pay the rent without allowing myself to show any undue emotion. 3 years passed like this. During this time, I earned a significant raise, increasing my salary so much that I could have felt true freedom for the first time, but I kept the news to myself, having learned my lesson well. Even mentioning financial success would send my parents a signal to demand more. I occasionally heard about David and Sarah through occasional phone calls from my mother, but more often I saw their lives only from a distance, through photos on social media, smiles against the backdrop of their new home, evenings with glasses of wine, and that very photo of them holding their newborn baby boy. I looked at the picture but didn't stop by to congratulate them, as our communication had long since been reduced to dry, formal birthday messages and short holiday cards that arrived without much warmth. I was content with my quiet, if somewhat lonely, life until one day I received a phone call that turned everything upside down. I recognized my mother's voice immediately. It was taut, like a string, and there was a tension in it that foreshadowed trouble. "Elma, we need to talk about your brother," she said, as if she were about to announce someone's illness. I froze, feeling my heart sink, and she continued, "There's been serious trouble with his business, he's gone bankrupt." My mother paused briefly, then added bitterly, "He had a terrible fight with Sarah's parents, they're furious at how he managed to ruin it all, and they're not speaking to him anymore." I closed my eyes, knowing what was coming, and silently prayed to God that my assumptions would be proven wrong. "He's coming home," Mom said, emphasizing the word as if she'd known I wouldn't be happy about the news. "With Sarah and the baby," she added, almost in a whisper, as if it were a death sentence. I asked cautiously, "I assume he'll be staying with you and Dad?" There was a brief pause, and my heart began to pound. "Actually," Mom finally breathed, "the apartment you're living in now is quite large, and he'll be comfortable there. He'll stay with you." The phone almost slipped out of my hand. I almost screamed, "Mom, this is my home. I've lived here for years." But in response, I heard a calm, cool, "Don't be dramatic, Elma, your brother needs help, he doesn't have any money, so he'll live there for free, and you can keep paying the rent." I shuddered with indignation, and I felt my insides tighten. This is absurd. I couldn't resist. "If he's moving, maybe I should find my own place?" My mother's voice snapped back, like a whip crack, "Don't you dare. We need your money now more than ever. David is going through a tough time, you don't want to make his life harder, do you?" I shook my head in utter bewilderment and, without another word, hung up, a silent despair seething within me. Their moving day turned out to be worse than I could have imagined. David showed up with Sarah and their perpetually crying baby, Tommy. Behind them trailed a mountain of suitcases, boxes, high chairs, bags of toys, and endless shopping bags. And then, to top it all off, my mother walked in, determined to help with the move, which in reality meant taking complete control and making my life as uncomfortable as possible. "Elma, clean your room," she said, placing her hands on her hips and Looking at me sternly, David and Sarah need space for Tommy's nursery. I stood in the doorway of my bedroom, my personal sanctuary, the only place I'd felt safe all these years. Mom, this is my room, I live here, I said, but she had already stepped inside and started pushing my things aside. There's a perfectly decent couch in the living room, she snapped. Not looking at me, that's where you'll fit. I stared at her wide-eyed, incredulously. You can't be serious. I pay full rent here, and you're kicking me out on the couch. Mom's face hardened, her voice icy. Don't be selfish, Elma, your brother has a kid, kids need proper rooms. I stood helplessly, watching as, in a matter of hours, my bedroom transformed into a nursery. A white changing table took my desk's place, my bed disappeared, replaced by a crib, and my books and clothes were unceremoniously dumped in the corner of the living room, where the sofa now stood. My new bedroom, my boundaries, my work, my life, all were swept away by a single decision, spoken by a strange voice in my own home. The following weeks became a never-ending nightmare. David wandered around the apartment for days, complaining now about his unfortunate fate, now about Sarah's ungrateful relatives, and sometimes reminiscing about the glory days when his business was thriving and he basked in the attention. Sarah, meanwhile, alternately cried and yelled at him over yet another argument about who should change Tommy's diapers, and their loud squabbles echoed through the walls of my apartment like an inescapable sound. The baby felt all the stress and cried almost incessantly, so much so that even at night the apartment was utterly haunted. I'd return home after long, exhausting workdays, dreaming only of lying down and losing myself in sleep for a few hours. Instead, I'd be greeted by a pile of dirty dishes in the sink, toys scattered all over the apartment, and laundry tumbled out of the hamper, as if deliberately emphasizing my status as the superfluous one. And in those moments, I'd wonder, at what point did my life stop being my own? The first few times I tried to ignore the mess, hoping it was temporary and that things would get better with time, but the dirty dishes by the sink had collected a swarm of ants. The scattered toys and mountains of socks made it impossible for me to relax even in the tiny part of the apartment that now called my bedroom, so I cleaned, washed and cooked, watching the food I had prepared mysteriously disappear before I could eat it. After a particularly hard day, I gritted my teeth and decided to extend an olive branch to David and, trying to speak evenly, said, "We have an opening at the company. I can put in a good word for you in HR. The benefits package is good, the starting salary is decent." But he just looked up from his phone and, with open indignation in his voice, replied, "An entry-level position? You're kidding, Elma. I'm not going to start from the bottom. I'm a businessman. I need a leadership position." And when I tried to gently remind him that we were all going through difficulties right now, he suddenly shouted that his relatives had set him up, went to his room, the same one where he once lived, and slammed the door, and I was left standing in the hallway and wondering how much longer I could tolerate this cohabitation. 3 months of forced coexistence turned our days into a series of irritations and unspoken jabs. I sat at the kitchen table, covered in dried remains of baby food and coffee stains, leafing through bank statements and not believing my eyes. My expenses had almost doubled since David and Sarah moved in with their crying baby, and one evening, gathering my courage, I called my mother on the phone, carefully choosing my words to maintain a calm tone, and said, "Mom, Dad, we need to have a serious talk about our living conditions. David and Sarah do not contribute to the expenses, they eat my food and use the utilities that I pay." But in response there followed a barrage of accusations. My mother, catching the phrase in a half-whisper, exclaimed that I was selfish and that my brother was going through hard times, and my father added from afar that I should be grateful that I could help the family, and when I insisted that I was helping not imaginary, and bearing the main financial burden, my mother declared that it was temporary and that I should be more understanding. That night, I opened my laptop and started looking through the ads, bookmarking a few suitable apartments within walking distance from the office. Estimating budgets, noting the landlord's phone numbers and thinking about how to sell unnecessary things to raise a deposit, because it was becoming clear to me, staying here was too expensive for my health and dignity, and I could not put off the step towards my own life any longer, and that was my real promise to myself. I not only noted the addresses, but I woke up in the middle of the night with anxiety, writing down rough budgets in a notebook, calculating what things I could sell from my old treasures to cover the deposit, and remembering what my grandmother once said, "Keep your place, girl, and it will not let you down." which now sounded like a lesson in not giving up. And sometimes I imagined myself putting the key in the new door and learning to listen to myself again. I knew leaving would require courage and planning, but also the hope that somewhere, I'd be reclaimed my right to peace and quiet. This gave me comfort and strength. And so I kept this route as a backup, silently repeating in my mind that it was just a backup, in case things got worse. It did get worse. Exactly 2 weeks later, I was sitting on my couch, which, by some absurd coincidence, had long since become my bed, trying to concentrate on work documents, but the noise around me was tearing my attention to shreds. The baby was whining in the corner, demanding attention, and David and Sarah were arguing for the fourth time that day about whose turn it was to rock Tommy and who was more tired. I could almost physically feel my patience wearing thin, and then the doorbell rang, and without the slightest wait, my parents walked inside, as if the apartment still belonged to them. Even though I'd been the one paying the rent for years, Mom had that expression I knew all too well. It always appeared when she heard great news about David, a new, expensive program, a prestigious school, another opportunity she felt she had to pay for. My father stood behind her, his eyes downcast, as if he were already ashamed of what he was about to hear. "Elma, we need to discuss rent," Mom said in a tone that left no room for argument. I looked up from my laptop and, trying to remain calm, replied, "I paid it on time, as always." "Yes, but starting next month it'll be doubled," she said, and the room fell silent, so thickly that even Tommy fell silent, as if sensing something serious was afoot. I stared at her, certain I'd misheard. "Doubled? But I'm already paying full market value." Her words came out firmer than I'd expected. Mom merely waved her hand around the apartment, as if summing it up. "There are more people living here now, more wear and tear, higher utilities. It's only fair that the rent reflects that." I couldn't help but laugh, but my laughter was as bitter as steel. "Fair? How is it fair that I sleep on the couch in my own living room, paying for every ruble, while David and Sarah occupy my room? If anyone should pay more, it certainly shouldn't be me." "Are you crazy?" David jumped up from his chair, his face flushed with indignation. "I lost everything, and now you want me to pay rent too?" "Of course not, dear," Mom interrupted softly, her face instantly softening, only to turn to stone again as she turned to me. "Elma, you have a good job, you can afford it, your brother needs time to get his act together." I looked at each of them, Mom, strict, expecting obedience, Dad, still averting his eyes, David, furious yet self-righteous, Sarah, smiling smugly, as if everything had been orchestrated for her comfort. 3 months of pent-up irritation nearly burst forth, but I swallowed it, simply nodded, and quietly said, "Okay, double rent starts next month." A satisfied smile spread across Mom's face, and soon she and Dad left, clearly pleased with how smoothly their announcement had gone. Little did they know that this conversation had just given me the final push, from which there was no turning back. Later that evening, I tried to read a book on my uncomfortable sofa bed, but every line blurred as David and Sarah's muffled conversation drifted in from the kitchen. They tried to whisper, but their excitement and complacency made their voices too clear. "Can you believe it?" Sarah giggled, "Your mom just told us we'll get half the rent every month." David's smug answer made my blood boil. "Of course," he said, "they understand we need help right now. Elma makes enough money, she can support us for a while, that's wonderful." Sarah continued, her voice sweet as honey, "And just as sticky, we'll live here for free, and we'll even have some extra pocket money. Your sister doesn't need to know about this." I sat in the dark, listening to their contented voices, and felt something inside me crack, as if the last thread holding my patience had snapped. I lay there, clutching the book so tightly that my knuckles were white, barely aware of the pain I was causing myself, but I couldn't stop, because at that moment something completely broke inside me. All this time, I'd assumed my parents were simply unfair, that their hearts were blinded by maternal pity and an eternal desire to care for David, but now I saw it clearly. It wasn't chaos or weakness, but a calculated plan, cold and cynical. They weren't simply allowing him to live off me, they'd deliberately arranged things so that I would pay for his laziness, his inaction, his habit of being the perpetual center of attention. I abruptly grabbed my laptop, opened the classifieds page, and almost automatically bookmarked one apartment that immediately caught my eye, a modern one-bedroom apartment in a neat building on a quiet street. and closer to my office than my current place, where every day was a struggle for air. The rent was exactly the same as I'd been paying before my parents decided to double up my responsibilities. And that felt like a sign. I didn't hesitate for a second, called the number, and, trying to keep my voice low so my words wouldn't carry through to anyone else's ears, said, "Hello, I'm interested in the apartment on Cedar Street. Yes, I can come see it right now. If that's possible, great, I'll be there in 15 minutes. The apartment turned out to be exactly what I'd dreamed of, bright, clean, and warm, free from the murmur of other people's arguments, the sound of a baby crying, and the lingering feeling of being a stranger in my own home. I signed the lease right there and then and paid a deposit from my savings, that cushion I'd been saving for so long in case of unforeseen circumstances, and now that moment had arrived. Returning, I waited until the apartment had fallen asleep, and then quietly, almost inaudibly, began packing my most essential things into 2 large suitcases. I didn't bother with the furniture. It wasn't just old, it was steeped in memories I wanted to shed. Let all that be in the past, along with the resentments, the anger, and the feeling of being used. I knew I would buy new furniture, and it would be a symbol of my freedom, my new beginning. In the morning, I rolled the suitcases out the door. David sat at the kitchen table, idly scrolling through job postings on his phone, and it was clear from his expression that he had no intention of taking a job anywhere. He glanced at me over the screen and asked, barely moving his lips, "A month-long business trip?" Yes, I lied without hesitation, a big project at our Cincinnati office. He merely chuckled and went back to his phone, and I realized he didn't care where I was or what was happening to me, as long as his familiar, caring world was not disturbed. That same evening, I moved into my new apartment. I ordered takeout, sat down on the floor in the empty living room, and listened to the silence, so deep and pure it made me dizzy. There was no crying baby, no endless arguments, no guilt that had been clenching my chest for the past few months. There was only peace. In the following weeks, I spent time settling into my new home. I bought a comfortable bed, a soft sofa that was truly a sofa, not a paltry substitute for a bed, and simple kitchen utensils that only I used. I cooked meals and calmly put the leftovers in the refrigerator, knowing they would be waiting for me, not vanishing into someone else's appetite. I slept at night, not awakened by Tommy's screams, and for the first time in a long time, I felt in control of my life. And then, as if on schedule, the phone rang, my mother's number. "Elma," she snapped without preamble, "why didn't you send the full rent? We agreed on double." I couldn't help but laugh, the laughter escaping naturally, but there was no joy in it, only weariness and understanding. "Mom, I know all about your little agreement with David and Sarah. Were you going to tell me that half my money went straight into their pockets?" "It's none of your business," she snapped. "Your brother needs help, he needs support, not your reproaches." "No, Mom," I interrupted, still grinning. "My brother needs to grow up and take responsibility for himself for once in his life. I moved out. I have my own place, and the apartment is now yours and David's." "You what?" My mother's voice broke into a shriek, so sharp and piercing that I pulled the phone away from my ear to keep from going deaf. "You can't do this, Elma, we need that rent money," she growled with that desperate, heart-rending edge I only heard in moments of true fear. I could almost see her lips trembling, and how behind those words lay not concern for me, but panic. Their usual source of income was disappearing, and instead of a dutiful daughter willing to shoulder someone else's expenses, they were left with an unemployed son who had never paid a bill in his life. "Well, I'm sure," I said, deliberately calmly, "that David will step up and start paying the rent. Now that he's had enough time to get back on his feet, I can't wait to see how it turns out." After my words, a dull, almost palpable pause hung over the phone. I could hear the gears turning in my mother's head, the familiar system she'd spent so many years building crumbling, and then her voice suddenly became cloyingly sweet, the way I remembered it from childhood, when she wanted something. "Elma, dear, let's not rush, we can talk about everything. Maybe we should go back to the original rent, just to make it fair." I settled deeper into my new sofa, so soft and cozy, the one I'd chosen and paid for myself, in my own apartment, where no one could kick me out of my bedroom, where it didn't smell like someone else's milk and irritation. "No, Mom," I answered evenly, "that won't happen." "But Elma, we're family," she tried again, as if the word would melt me. "Family? I interrupted, feeling the voice I'd been hiding for so many years slowly but surely rise within me. Is that what you call it when you scheme behind my back to funnel my money to David? When you kick me out of my own bedroom while I'm paying all the bills? When you've treated me like an ATM my whole life and David like royalty? That's not family, Mom, that's unfair. I heard her ragged breathing on the other end of the line, and then I pressed the red button, ending the conversation. My hand was shaking, but I knew it was necessary, and at that very moment, I blocked both her and my father's numbers. That was 6 months ago. Since then, my grandparents have kept me informed of what's going on, even though I haven't asked them for anything. They simply understand that I need to know, not to feel sorry, but to make sure I made the right choice. According to them, David, Sarah, and Tommy still live in that apartment. They haven't made a single payment in months. Mom and Dad pay all the utilities and even give them pocket money, because the kid needs things. My brother still hasn't found a job. Apparently, there aren't many management positions for bankrupt businessmen with a history of bankruptcy. My new life is as calm as the smooth surface of water in the early morning. I got another promotion, bought myself a car, and started taking night classes to get my MBA. My apartment is always clean, my food stays in the fridge until I'm ready to eat it, and at night I sleep in my own bed, unwoke by a crying baby or arguments next door. The other day, I ran into Sarah's cousin at the grocery store. She told me, smiling shyly, that they were expecting another child. I smiled back and wished them all the best, feeling a lightness inside that I'd never felt before. I knew that somewhere in this city, my parents were probably already figuring out how to pay for more daycare. But that wasn't my problem anymore. For the first time in my life, I put myself first, and I feel absolutely right.